Welcome everyone to the Monday morning Dig Into Your Day with Cover Crops and Conservation webinar series. We're glad that you could join us again this morning. I think many of you have been on the series for most of the presenters, so welcome back. And for those of you that are new, we ask that you type your questions into the chat box or the Q&A, and when our speaker is done presenting today, we'll have a Q&A after that. If you are in need of CCA credits or would like a CCA credit for the webinar today, please email Catherine Davidson. Her email's at the bottom of this slide. And of course, thank you to the funders that are helping us put on this webinar series. I think we're going to have a different type of outreach this year, and so we're starting with webinars and hopefully do some virtual field days this summer. But thanking the Eastern Region Soybean Board, USDA SARE, and USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture for supporting our webinar series. All right, and today we have a guest speaker from New Hampshire. Welcome, Natalie. Thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here.
Yeah, great. So Natalie is probably at home today in New Hampshire. She's a PhD candidate at UNH in the Earth and Environmental Sciences Department, and she's been working on reduced tillage in organic vegetable systems with cover crops for almost a decade, starting out in Maryland with the forage radish, and now in New Hampshire working on a practice called tarping, which is relatively sort of new, at least new to our region. And there's been a lot of interest in that. So we're excited that you could join us today for the webinar.
Thanks, Heather.
Yeah. So we'll just let you share your screen and get started if you would, and we'll save the questions for the end.
All right. Hi, everybody out there in wherever you are. Yeah, so these webinars, I was just saying to Heather, they're always a little bit weird for me. And so I really thrive on audience interaction, so I can't see you, but please type your questions into the chat box, and hopefully we can have some interaction at the end of this all. So like Heather said, today I'm going to be talking about no-till and cover crops in vegetable systems with an organic focus. And a couple different projects I've worked on, all of which have been sponsored by SARE. So another shout out to SARE. Thanks for funding this good work. And in terms of where this talk fits into no-till vegetable production, I wanted to kind of present this schematic here that it really, I think, comes down to, working out the kinks. Okay, it comes down to weed management. And so with weed management, we've got herbicides and then we've got no herbicides. And if you use herbicides, you can rely on them solely, or you can integrate them with cover crops. You've got just a little more flexibility, I will admit, if you can use herbicides judiciously. But if we're not using herbicides, we have a couple different options. One is just to smother or bury that weed seed bank entirely. And you can do this with heavy compost applications or with leaf mulch applications. There are an increasing number of growers, I would say, who are doing this, but it does have some downsides. So it generally requires external inputs. You can't produce that amount of compost on your own farm usually, which can lead to nutrient loading and sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul. But if you do establish this system with these beds that have a high compost or leaf litter on top, you can practice continuous no-till if you maintain that weed-free status and don't allow any weed seeds to get in there. Another option is that you can just suppress the weed seed bank. And this is what I'm going to be talking about more today. And so this is through practices like cover crops and tarps. This practice also has some downsides. Cover crop management is knowledge intensive. Usually still requires rotational tillage, so you can't completely eliminate the need for tillage. And it often requires some in-season weed control. Some other resources I wanted to point people to if you're interested in some of these other systems or just in more information about no-till vegetables, because this is only a half-hour webinar and I'm only one person. There's a bunch of good videos on the E-Organic YouTube channel, including the Weed 'em and Reap series with Ron Morse, who was he's a retired professor at Virginia Tech, and he did a lot of research on using cover crops for reduced tillage in organic and non-organic systems. So those are great videos to check out. Another webinar is about a different system in Germany, rotational no-till and mulching system for organic farms. It's just a different approach, and I would highly recommend that. Finally, there's some fact sheets, and then I do have a website, No-Till Veggies, which I haven't updated in a couple years, but I'm motivated to update it now that I'm stuck at home, but we'll see if that happens. And then also this book recently came out. I have a copy. I haven't read it, but this guy, Brian O'Hara, is a farmer in Connecticut who's been doing these small scale continuous no-till systems for quite a while. So I always feel like, you know, I'm a researcher. I'm not fully implementing these systems on my farm. And so it's nice to get the perspective of some farmers who are actually doing that. So cover crops, I watched Rob Meyer's presentation, and I love his talks on cover crops, and he always uses this figure from SARE, which I think is cool. It's the Swiss Army knife of cover crop benefits. You know, you can build organic matter, control weeds, provide nitrogen, etc. There's this multifunctional tool, and I love it. But I always want to remind people that they are a tool, but you can also accidentally stab yourself if you don't use them correctly. So you can create a weed problem that you can't control. You can decrease yields if you don't implement the system right. You can tie up nitrogen instead of making nitrogen available, and you can deplete soil moisture. So cover crops can do a lot of things. They can provide a lot of benefits, but they can also make your system more complicated. So I wrote, this may be a function of being home too much, but I wrote a cover crop haiku that I think really summarizes the point of my talk today. And so if you want to just listen to the haiku, then you don't need to listen to the rest of the webinar, I guess. But so the haiku is: biomass it takes, time, commitment, warmth, and sun. Win includes trade-offs. In other words, you get more benefits from your cover crops if you have more biomass, but it takes more time, knowledge, and management intensity the more biomass you have. So it comes with trade-offs. You can't get all the benefits of cover crops if you just plant a wimpy little rye crop at the end of October and then you terminate it at the beginning of May. You'll get some benefits, but not all of them. And so in terms of no-till organic, weeds are really the biggest obstacle. And so I wanted to spend some time talking about the weed seed life cycle and management. So you start out with this dormant weed seed bank. There are a bunch of weeds in there. They're just waiting for the right cues to germinate. And so once they get those cues, they break dormancy. They start to germinate. And then once they've germinated in their seedlings, you can manage them by killing them with tillage, herbicides, thermal methods, or tarps. If you don't kill them and they survive to reproduce, then you get seed rain. Those seeds go back into your dormant seed bank. If you're not careful, your dormant seed bank can grow. Yeah, and so that's what you don't want. If you rely on this seedling stage management too much, for example, if you rely on excessive tillage to control your weeds, then you can end up with serious soil problems, which is the whole reason we've come back to these ideas of cover crops and reduced tillage, is because we're trying to protect our soil. So you can end up with poor aggregation, crusting, erosion, and these problems are particularly present in vegetable systems, I would say, because they tend to rely on a lot of tillage. If you don't rely on tillage and you rely on herbicides and you're not integrating cover crops and other practices, then excessive herbicides use can lead to herbicide resistance. So these methods of managing your weeds at the seedling stage can have some problems. So that's where ecological weed management comes into play. So instead of this model where you just have this seedling death at the management stage, you also have some biological seedling death. Now that can happen from damping off, or when you have competition from a crop that's shading out the weeds, or a mulch. You can also have seed bank losses. Those can occur through predation, pathogens and decay, and just loss over time of the viability of those seeds in the seed bank. I am putting forth, and if there's one take-home message that you keep from this, that the most important pathway that cover crops use to suppress weeds is suppressing the dormant to active pathway. So it's just keeping weed seed banks dormant, not letting them germinate. And when you do that, you have fewer weeds that move into that active or germinating box. You have less seedling management that you need to do via herbicides or tillage, and you have those weed seeds hanging out in the dormant seed bank, which means that you have more seed bank losses. So that's kind of ecological weed management, the quick version of ecological weed management. So if we go back to this figure that I shared before, you see that when you rely on herbicides, you're relying on seedling stage management. When you're doing this practice of burying the weed seed bank with compost or leaves, what you're basically doing is eliminating the weed seed bank, so there's nothing that can germinate. They're buried. I mean, they're still there, but they can't germinate. They can't get those cues. And then if you're suppressing the weed seed bank with cover crops and tarps, sorry, I'm just gonna, then you're just keeping those weed seeds dormant. I'm going to talk about two sample systems of rotational no-till with cover crops. And this is what I did for my master's and now what I'm working on for my PhD. So first, the low residue winter killed cover crops, which is forage radish. And then next I'll talk about the high residue rye vetch terminated with tarps. So forage radish as a weed suppressing cover crop before early spring cups. The key to the system is that there's fall canopy closure early in the fall, which keeps those winter annuals dormant. And there was a grad student who did her whole PhD on looking at the mechanism of forage radish weed suppression, and she did find that it was this mechanism of keeping those weed seeds dormant. So common winter annuals include chickweed, henbit, horseweed, shepherd's purse. So when you have this system and you get that complete fall canopy closure, then you have no weeds in early spring. And the radish winter kills, there's very low residue, and it's possible to direct seed early crops like spinach. You can direct seed them even without a no-till planter. This is just a Matermac planter without any special no-till attachments. And then you can grow your crop Eventually, however, the summer annual weeds will start to grow because there's nothing stopping them from germinating. There's no residue on the surface, so they can get those cues and germinate. So you do need another weed management tactic. Another example of this system, I talked a little about the spinach and peas and early direct seeded crops, but there was a farmer in New Hampshire, he now lives in Maine, who used this system in their horse-powered farm, and he precision planted those radishes so that he could then transplant onions into the radish holes. And where there weren't radish holes, he would use a dibbler to make the little hole. And then because he had precision planted the radishes and the onions were all in their rows, he could come in and do his in-season weed control with their horse-drawn cultivators. So the keys to success, it's early and complete canopy closure. In case you haven't gotten that message. So these dates are for Maryland. They're not for New England like we are, but you can see the difference between a cover crop. There are forage radishes planted in September and a forage radish is planted about a month later in October. You just don't get the growing degree days and the biomass that you need to get that canopy closure to suppress those winter annuals. So you have to have early seeding in fall. I think that's about early August in New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont. You have to have even distribution of that cover crop. You can't have gaps so that the canopy is complete, and you have to have enough fertility and water so the canopy is complete. So the take-home message is you need to have complete canopy closure for this system to work. So moving on to the next system, the high residue rye and vetch terminated with tarps. So yeah, these are some of the folks who work in our lab, and I think the actual conversation was really what plot are we in and when are the donuts arriving, but kind of the research question was, can we kill this rye and vetch and will it suppress weeds enough to eliminate tillage? And I think the answer through experience is that it's really hard to kill rye and vetch. But that maybe tarps could help. So the origins of this system come from organic rotational no-till with cover crops that has been researched a lot more in the mid-Atlantic, Pennsylvania, Maryland, where you can grow these really high biomass cover crops, and where folks have been using these implements called roller crimpers. And I'm guessing that Joel Groover, I didn't see his webinar, but I'm guessing that he talked about this system when he talked about organic rotational no-till with cover crops. So that's kind of the inspiration behind it, but we were thinking, well, how can we make this work in northern New England and on small scale vegetable farms? Because the limitations are that you need very high biomass to suppress weeds through the competition and through the residual mulch. You need about 8,000 kilograms per hectare. And the timing of termination is tricky. That's what I was talking about with the maturity, especially with rye vetch bicultures. It can be very difficult to terminate vetch. And also roller crimpers are expensive and specialized. A lot of small scale vegetable farmers don't want to buy or can't afford to buy another piece of equipment. So that's where we thought, all right, well, what about silage tarps and occultation, which is this practice that was popularized by the market gardener. These tarps are popular enough now that they carry them at Johnny's. They carry them in a lot of places. They've generally been used for kind of an alternative stale seedbed technique. So putting a tarp directly onto bare soil and getting those weeds to germinate, then removing the tarp and seeding or transplanting into that. But we thought, well, what about using this tarp in conjunction with cover crops to make this organic rotational no-till system work? So Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania worked on the organic rotational no-till, and they published this book called Beyond Black Plastic, all about how we can get rid of plasticulture by using cover crops. And unfortunately, we just have found that we can't do that in New England. So we're sort of not yet beyond black plastic. But these tarps are reusable and have a long life. So it is a different situation than plasticulture, where you're disposing of plastic every year. And when we introduce tarps, we don't have to think about completely terminating the cover crops anymore with a roller crimper. We can just lay down the cover crops so that we can put the tarp on top. So instead of an expensive roller crimper, you can use an implement like a lawn roller, which is about $150. This one is pulled behind a little riding mower, but you can also get them that are human powered, and you just pull or push them. And we use this in some of our research, and I found it to be really fantastic. Some other farmers have come up with some human powered ways of laying down cover crops. This one is just a board with two people. Some people have tried adding an angle iron, but they found that it doesn't actually make it a crimper. People don't have enough force to turn it into a real crimper. And then this one is cute, another human powered way of rolling down a cover crop. This is from Frith Farm in Scarborough. As long as there's no bees in there, that is a great way to do it. So in this system, which pathways are we trying to target? Again, we're targeting this dormant to active pathway, really trying to keep those weed seeds dormant through cover crop competition, through the residual mulch that's going to be there after the cover crop is terminated, and then possibly additional maintenance of dormancy through that tarping period. And then those weeds that do make it through into that active germinating path, we're trying to manage with tarps to kill the weeds that are present in the cover crop, and also to encourage fatal germination of weed seeds. Our research history on this concept goes back to 2015. We first started with some experiments where we were asking, does this work? And we tried black tarps and clear tarps to see which one worked better. I'm not going to get into the details of it today, but our conclusion was that black tarps are more consistent in our climate for suppressing weeds in this system. There is a place for using clear tarps, certainly, and there's room for more research, but we found that black tarps were more consistent. Then we did another experiment looking at no-till versus tillage with and without tarps. Again, I'm not going to get into that experiment too much, but we found, surprise, surprise, there were variable results. I feel like there almost always are in agricultural research. But we did find that no-till yields of cabbage were equal or better than our tilled yields, which is important to remember. But the weed response to tarps is inconsistent. Tarps are not a silver bullet when it comes to weeds in this system. And it seems that the performance is related to cover crop biomass. I did want to make a note that another tool we used for this project was a tree dibbler for transplanting. If you're working on a larger scale, there are high biomass transplanters, but we were working on a small scale, so that's what we used, and it worked great. If folks have questions, I can definitely provide more information about that. And then the experiment that I'm going to talk more about today was asking the research question, what are the trade-offs of tarp application date and the duration of tarping? So we did this for 2 seasons. We did it in Maine in 2018 to 2019, and New Hampshire in 2019 to 2020. We got aerial photos of both of those experiments, which is always cool. And the questions that we were interested in with respect to those trade-offs had to do with cover crop biomass and nitrogen accumulation, weed dynamics, and soil nutrients. And sorry, this is, but the ones I'm going to talk about today are cover crop biomass and weed dynamics. So the experimental design was a little bit complicated, but we seeded the rye vetch in mid to late September. We thought that that is a realistic time when farmers could be seeding rye and vetch. You know, we could have seeded it a little bit earlier in August, but it seems like most farmers have a lot easier time getting in a cover crop in mid to late September than they do getting one in August. So that's when we did it. We had, then in the spring, we had 3 application times for tarps, and they were 10 days apart. And then our treatments included a 10, 20, and 30-day tarp, plus a glyphosate treatment. And then at UNH only, we had a roll-crimp only treatment. So we were looking at these different application dates and different tarp durations. And this resulted in multiple possible planting dates, but we didn't actually grow a crop. We were just interested in looking at the weed and nutrient dynamics. So our assumption in this was that no-till works, but we need to understand the trade-offs and optimize the system. One important thing I want to note is that I mentioned we seeded our cover crop in mid to late September, and the growing degrees in spring for winter hardy cover crops are much more important than growing degrees in fall. That's not to say that an earlier planting date in fall doesn't matter, but it matters more how long you let that cover crop grow in spring. So this is from our experiment in Maine. This is May 7th, and it's a wimpy looking little cover crop. But then by June 21st, it's absolutely huge. So to see the actual data for that, 10 days in June is a lot of growing degree days. So here we've got Maine on the left and UNH on the right. And Maine is the site where we're working, is quite a bit further north. We had our first termination date was June 10th. And then at UNH, our first termination date was May 21st. And you can see that it's almost a linear relationship between biomass accumulation and time. And that you get almost double the biomass if you leave it for 20 days or just about 3 weeks longer in spring. Now, you'll remember that I said that to use the cover crop based rotational no-till and get good weed suppression, you need about 8,000 kilograms per hectare if you're not using tarps, if you're just using that cover crop biomass. And so at that one date in UNH, we got close to 8,000 kilograms per hectare, but all the other times we were pretty far from 8,000 kilograms per hectare. And this is, you know, these are sites where we were really conscientious about seeding the cover crop and getting uniform distribution and all that. So my point is just that in these northern climates, it's really hard to get that super high biomass that you need to get weed suppression without help, without the tarps. I always like to show what that looks like visually. And the reason for that is that I think a lot of times people will say like, oh yeah, I had a really good cover crop, but maybe it was not quite as high biomass as it could have been. So on the top here, we've got from the Maine site. This is what it looks like in June. That's about 3,400 kilograms per hectare. Then 10 days later, 4,400. And then finally, beginning of July, almost 6,000 kilograms per hectare. And you can see that there's a lot more vetch in that final date, which means there's a lot more nitrogen. Again, and then in the bottom, we've got UNH, and on May 21st, that cover crop was barely at my waist. And then by June 10th, that cover crop was above my head. So that time in the spring really matters. And I think that a lot of people, because dealing with a super high biomass cover crop can be really unwieldy, a lot have not their crops grow to this point, so they've never seen just how big it can get. Growing degree days are especially important for vetch and nitrogen accumulation. This is approximated data. I don't have the data yet, and I don't know when I'll get it because of the lab shutdowns and COVID-19. But if you let that vetch grow until that last termination date, you get more than double the nitrogen as the first termination date. So that's really important for saving on organic fertilizer. And if you have a pretty good nitrogen or pretty good vetch stand, it may be possible to dramatically reduce your fertilizer needs. What does the weed biomass look like? What does this whole mulch system look like after tarps? And on the left here, we've got, I think I'm taking a weed sample about 25 days after tarp removal. And this is for one of the later termination dates. So this was a higher cover crop biomass. And then on the right, we've got my mom taking a weed sample on the earlier cover crop termination date. So there was less cover crop biomass, and you can see that there are more weeds. Looking at the actual data, this is the data from Maine. We've got that idealized planting date. Again, we didn't actually plant anything on the x-axis, and we've got the weed biomass 25 days after planting date on the y-axis. And you can see that for the 10-day tarp, there's quite a bit of weeds, whereas for the 20-day, 30-day tarp and glyphosate, there's significantly less weed biomass after that period. And this is for that first tarp application date on mid-June. For that second tarp application date, this relationship looks a little bit different. The 10-day tarp has substantially less weed biomass. And then for that final tarp application date, there are no differences between the 10, 20, 30-day tarp and glyphosate. So there's a similar trend of decreasing weed biomass with the longer tarp duration for those first two application dates. But when you have higher initial cover crop biomass, the duration of tarping doesn't matter. So in other words, if you let your cover crop grow to become a high biomass cover crop, you don't need to leave the tarp down as long to get good weed suppression because you have much more mulch. But if you tarp earlier and you don't have the cover crop biomass, you need to leave the tarp down longer to get adequate weed suppression. So there are trade-offs. A couple of caveats. Both tarps and glyphosate were 100% effective at terminating the cover crops in Maine. But at UNH, the 10-day tarp duration did not kill cover crops completely for the early tarp application date. And the roll-crimp treatment, which we only had at UNH, was never effective at killing vetch. So here we've got vetch regrowth on the y-axis, the treatment on the x-axis, and you can see the yellow there is the roll-crimp treatment. Roll-crimp never kills vetch effectively. Sorry, I keep losing my cursor. Never kills vetch effectively, at least in this time period that we were looking at. And the 10-day tarp in that early application date also had a little bit of vetch regrowth. For rye regrowth, roller crimping was very effective at killing rye for that second and third application date, but that first application date, it just wasn't quite mature enough. So there was some rye regrowth in the yellow, the roll crimp. And there was also some vetch regrowth, some rye regrowth for the 10-day tarp application. So that time, it probably has to do with a combination of cover crop maturity, the weather at the time. So 10 days may not always be enough for completely terminating cover crops. Wanted to talk a little bit about farmer experience. So this is Frith Farm in Scarborough, Maine. They were one of our farmer collaborators on this project. Frith Farm is a little bit unique in that they really made an effort. They started with this idea of sort of burying the weed seed bank or completely eliminating the weed seed bank. So they did have very heavy compost and leaf applications for several years prior to implementing this cover crop based no-till system. And so they sort of went from one to the other. And it was very effective for them because they are able, because of the fertility on their farm, they're able to grow really high biomass cover crops. They can terminate them effectively with tarps, and then they can grow these sort of weed-free crops. So conclusions, and I don't even have a sense of what time it is, but successful cover crop based no-till requires managing that dormant to active pathway for the weed seed bank model. And to do this requires high biomass and targeting the right temporal niche. So for example, I talked about the forage radish cover crop, which suppresses those winter annual weeds, and then this high residue tarping system, which suppresses those summer annual weeds. Tarps may help with weed suppression if the biomass isn't enough, but you still need pretty high biomass. You can't get away with having a really wussy cover crop and expect that tarps are going to solve all of your weed problems. And reducing the weed seed bank and improving soil health will make implementing cover crop based no-till more feasible. So we did have some farmer collaborators who tried implementing this system basically in a field that had been a hay field. It was pretty compacted. They tilled it, planted a rye cover crop, and then tried doing this. And they just didn't have the soil tilth that they needed, and the reduction in their perennial weeds and the weed seed bank that is kind of necessary for implementing this system effectively. Yeah, and so a lot of folks have helped with this research, including the whole agroecology lab at University of New Hampshire, my mom, who was my research assistant at River Rise Farm in Maine, and then our friends at UMaine Extension and farmer collaborators. So with that, hopefully that wasn't too quick, and I can take some questions.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. That was awesome. Very informative and right on time. We still have a few minutes for questions. Okay. Yeah, so if folks have questions, please get them in the chat box or the Q&A box. And I believe Catherine is going to share a quick poll as well for folks to answer a few questions about our webinar series. We would appreciate that. So if you can take a second and answer those and get your questions in the box. We have a lot of participants today, which is great. So obviously some interest in this topic. Natalie, when are you finishing up? Or are you more years or just writing now?
I hope to finish up next year, next spring.
Oh, good, good. If there was any, what would be your next phase of research for tarping if you were going to continue to do more work on this area?
I think I think understanding what's happening beneath the tarps. So it's still a little bit of a black box in terms of what's going on with cover crop decomposition, nutrient dynamics, weeds. We're trying to understand some of that, but we are getting sort of mixed results from year to year. Does the tarping increase decomposition or decrease decomposition? And I think it, has a lot to do with the weather and the moisture conditions under the tarp. So I think just drilling down on that. I'd be curious about also specific weed species that are affected by this. I'd also be curious about implementing it with other cover crops. So this is, just that sort of the winter hardy high residue, but I wonder about things like if you did a summer cover crop, could you a high biomass Sudan grass or something, could a tarp help to terminate that in fall and for different crops. So yeah, just different temporal niches.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder, do we know if tarping kills quackgrass? That's really.
I think the quick answer is no, unless you are doing it with for an extended period of time, like a very extended period of time.
Well, we tried tarping on our own farm last year, and it's been a long-term tarping. So we put the tarp on, I want to say it was last June, and we haven't taken it off since. And I can't really tell you why we haven't, but I looked at it the other day and I thought, boy, I hope it's really weed free under there now. So it's time, like time obviously has an impact, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean time and robbing those rhizomes of nutrients. So
great.
Yeah, I think some people have looked at solarizing quackgrass, and I think that may be a little bit more effective. Really, like cook it during the summer.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions. One person just said, great presentation. You got me thinking. They don't have any questions right now, but after they process the information, they may have some questions. Can people reach out to you, Natalie? Do you mind if people do that?
Yeah, you can reach out to me. You can find my contact information at, sorry, I forgot to put it up here, but you can find it at my website, which is no-tillveggies.org.
Can you see the chat box? Can you type it in there?
Yeah, I can do.
And then that way people can see it. Yep, perfect. And then do you have any figures for the cost values of amount of N fixed by the cover crop versus crop needs of N if purchased?
Yeah, I don't have any figures, but I think off the top of my head, if you're buying a nitrogen source like soybean meal or something, that is going to tend to be somewhere between, or poultry litter, somewhere between $5 and $10 a pound for nitrogen. And those cover crops tend to have, a radish cover crop can have 100, 150 pounds of nitrogen easily. That's not that that's all available, but say you get 50 pounds of that available, that's, could be $500 per acre of fertilizer replacement value. So I think, it depends on the cover crop. It depends on how available that nitrogen is and when, but it can be substantial savings.
Great.
And then the question, what if the N is being applied with compost? Yeah, I haven't done that math, but I think that the nice thing about combining cover crops with compost is that you're not going to lose you're not going to lose much of that nitrogen over the winter. So if you're relying on compost for a lot of your nitrogen needs, there's substantial potential to lose a lot of that over the winter.
Great. Well, we're out of time. And as Natalie said, you can contact her through her email. It looks like your contact form isn't working on your website. Someone.
Yeah, I'll try to update that. But my email is right there.
Great. And I appreciate the webinar, somebody said, so very good. And I'm assuming if you're a part of the PDP SARE no-till project, you can stay on after the webinar and ask questions if you have them. But otherwise, everyone have a great day. Thanks, Natalie. We really appreciate it. And stay safe out there.
All right, bye.
Bye.